You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I am so happy to be back, and I hope you all are well. So I have a very much requested show for you this week. About a year ago, Mel Robbins, who, if you don't know, is a very, very popular podcaster, shared that at the age of 47, she had been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, otherwise known as ADHD. And she talks about how she is part of a huge population of kind of lost women, who were never diagnosed because when our generation, when we were girls, ADHD or hyperactivity, as it was called, was something that it was a boy's condition. It was something that you didn't really look for in girls. And like so many things, it's not that girls and women don't have or get ADHD or it's not something that affects us. It's because it presents differently in us. But again, like so many things, nobody ever thought to consider or study that. So we've been pretty left out to suffer. And I have heard from a lot of you asking for a show on this. Some of you have recently discovered it yourself after flogging yourself for literally your whole lives, for being quote unquote scatterbrained and suffering with tons of anxiety and finding life absolutely unmanageable once you hit menopause. And others have told me that you had been diagnosed earlier, but once you hit perimenopause or the menopause transition, you couldn't manage it any longer. The stuff that once worked for you no longer worked. And I'll be clear, this is something that I knew very little about going into this show. So I took my time and really looked into it, and I found a great expert to explain how ADHD presents in girls and women, and very importantly, how our ovarian hormones, especially estrogen, plays a key role in how it presents across our lifespan. And that guest name is Dr. Kathleen Nadeau. And she is the author or co author of over a dozen books related to ADHD that address ADHD issues across the lifespan, including the only book focused on older adults called Still Distracted After All These Years. And as we talk about in this interview, she is currently working on a new book specifically for women. She is also the founder of the Chesapeake Center, ADHD Learning and Behavioral Health. It's one of the largest private ADHD specialty centers in the United States. It was a great illuminating conversations, and I will put the resources that she mentions in the show notes so you can check those out at your leisure if you're suffering and want more help. Or if you're listening and think, wait a minute, this sounds like me, I will put resources in the notes for you as well that you can take a look and at some of those resources, see the common signs and symptoms, and also pursue an appointment to get evaluated if that's something that you think would help you out. So I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. I learned a ton, and I really appreciate Dr. Nadeau for coming and clarifying so many of these issues for us. All right, before we get to it, give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Feisty Menopause. Come join our private Hit Play Not Pause Facebook group. And don't forget to sign up for my free weekly Feisty 40 Plus newsletter, which has all the news you need and weekly workouts with Dr. Carla DiGirolamo. Thanks as always for the kind reviews and 5-star ratings that continue to come in. We are going on 4 years of this show. I can hardly believe it. And I would not be here without you. Okay, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. Okay, Dr. Nadeau, thank you so much for joining us. Before I hit record, I told you that I have had a request for this show probably going on 4 years. So it's very long overdue. So thank you for answering my cold call email and agreeing to do a show with us.
Well, I am delighted that you called me. Women and girls, because before we were women, we're girls. Women and girls with ADHD has been my life's mission for almost 30 years now. I have been in the field of ADHD, and I remember writing one of the very first books on adult ADHD. And
Mm,
this was back in the early 90s, and having lunch with a friend who said, "So, what's your next project going to be?" And I literally hadn't even thought of my next project. I just finished that book on adult ADHD. And during the course of that lunch, I said, it has to be women and girls.
interesting.
Nobody is doing anything. And this was in the mid 1990s that we had that conversation. So almost 30 years ago. And at that time, it was so clear to me because I'd been in the trenches treating families.
Yeah.
And guess what? Lots of mothers brought little boys in because way back when we thought it was a condition of little boys. And then they would start talking about their own struggles. And do you think I might have it? I know I'm nothing like my son, but we still share some of the same traits. And so it just became so clear to me. And what's interesting, I come from a very interesting family myself. In fact, I joke that we have one of everything in my
Hmm,
family in terms of, differences. And it became more and more clear to me that, first of all, my daughter, who's now middle aged, she's post menopause,
mhm.
had ADHD, and she was so clearly ADHD that she was diagnosed by her pediatrician when she was 4 years old. And that was very unusual in that time. I mean, that was in the mid 70s that she was diagnosed. And the reason she got misdiagnosed is she had tiny little bruises all over her shins and her arms because she was a tree climber, and she was always bumping into the corners of tables and rushing through the room. And, so she had the physical manifestations of ADHD. And she was sitting there on the examination table, wiggling her legs, and, and the pediatrician says she has ADHD. Bingo. But I wasn't like that as a kid, so it didn't occur to me yet that I had it. But I had a younger brother who was the classic. I mean, he was, fidgety and rambunctious and hated school and impatient and independent and rebellious. And you knew when Richard was in the room, and he was a challenge for all of his teachers. And I was nothing like that. I was a good student. I liked school, even though there were elements of hyperactivity. And I started, the more I worked with families, the more I thought about my own family and myself. And this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. We're talking a long, long time ago before women's ADHD became a thing. And one of the things I remember, even though I was quiet and I did as I was told and I made good grades, but I was a compulsive chair tipper. I couldn't sit, and my father was just frantic. You're going to fall over. You're going to split your head open. Stop that, stop that. And I put all four legs down. And without even realizing it, less than 5 minutes later, I was tipping my chair again. And I remember my grandmother was visiting during one of these arguments about chair tipping, and she said, "Get that girl a rocking chair," that
Yeah.
which I thought was a very creative solution. So I became just gradually more and more aware of, I've got this thing too, and it looks really different in females. So I've been thinking about ADHD in females for a long, long time as I watch my daughter, who's now postmenopausal, grow up. And she has two daughters, both of whom have ADHD. It's very familial. And what your listeners may not realize, a lot of people don't realize, is that women with ADHD are more likely to pass it on to their children than men with ADHD.
Hmm.
So it's a powerful genetic connection.
Interesting. I did not know that.
And I look back at what I was taught in grad school. I was taught that it was boys. I was taught that it was mostly hyperactivity and
Yep.
behavior management problems. And I was taught that they're going to start to outgrow it when they hit adolescence. And they thought that because hyperactivity does lessen as boys go through adolescence and into young adulthood. And so all of that was true, but I always use the analogy of the blind men and the elephant, that they were looking at one little tiny part of the elephant and saying, this part of the elephant
Hmm.
is common in boys and goes away or lessens at least
Hmm.
throughout adolescence. And so they thought this whole thing, we didn't call it ADHD then, we called it hyperkinesis. We before that we even called it minimal brain dysfunction. Like there's something wrong with your brain. It's not too bad, so it's minimal brain dysfunction. We did not know what we were talking about. Yeah, and
Wow.
and so when I give lectures on where do you find the girls, I always say one really good place to look for them is to look at the sisters of boys with ADHD. It's so genetic, it runs in families. And those sisters are going to look different, but they're going to be having difficulty with time awareness and organization. They're the ones that are forgetful and spacey and always running late. And mom, I forgot my lunch. Can you drive to the school? And all of that stuff that we never uh, attributed to ADHD when we were just looking at boys.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so that sort of answered one of my questions. I guess my just a step one step back, and you know, you alluded that as with any condition and with science in general, our understanding evolves, everything is iterative. What actually is ADHD, and do we now know the root cause?
Well, that's a simple question that does not have a simple answer.
Okay.
And by that, I mean that one of the things that's been so exciting over the course of my long career is we've learned more and more and more about the brain and continue to learn more and more about the brain. And so, what somebody would have told you 25 years ago is the cause of ADHD, you would have been told that it is basically a dopamine insufficiency in the prefrontal lobes. And so our prefrontal lobes don't work very well. And that's why stimulant medication helps, because it increases the dopamine. And it was just this very simple. And I had a very bright, very informed psychologist say that to me a week ago. Isn't it just a dopamine insufficiency in the prefrontal lobes? And so you take a pill for it. And you teach some people some life hacks. They take the pill, they learn a few life hacks, they're good to go. Well, it's so much incredibly more complicated than that. And the more we've been able to do brain imaging,
Hmm.
the more we're able to understand what's going on in the brain, the more complicated it becomes. So, one of the things that we know about ADHD, and you're not going to find it in the diagnostic criteria, but emotional dysregulation is a huge important component of ADHD. And for your listeners, emotional dysregulation uh, is across the whole span of intense emotions. It can mean poor anger management, but it just as likely, especially for females, means intense emotional reactions that if something bumps into me and cuts me and I don't have ADHD, I might go, ouch. If I have ADHD, I might start weeping and it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Just that our emotional reaction, whether it's fear, anger, hurt, demoralization, there's just an intensification of emotional reactions. And nobody was talking about that 15 or 20 years ago.
Interesting.
The other thing that nobody was talking about until maybe 20 years ago were executive functioning skills. And executive functioning means being able to plan and manage and follow through on the countless tasks that we have to do in life. I mean, it takes executive functioning just to get up and get dressed and get out the door on time and remember what we're supposed to do and remember to pick up the milk on your way home. I mean, just the daily tasks of life. And the more complicated the task is, the more executive functioning it requires. And so you might be interested in this. It's not directly related to women, but it's an important aspect of understanding what this thing is called ADHD. And that is that you can be very smart and very accomplished and still have ADHD. And a lot of people say that doesn't make any sense. And I've often said in my lectures that if you gathered a collection of people who had done well in college, gone to graduate school, passed all their courses, passed their qualifying exams, and never finished their dissertation,
Hmm.
and that's a pretty large group,
Hmm.
you'd have a group of very smart, accomplished people with undiagnosed ADHD.
Interesting.
That the executive functioning skills required to do this giant, complicated research project all by yourself is just beyond their executive functioning skills. And that very same person, were they diagnosed? Were they taking stimulants? Were they working with a coach, especially an academic coach? They could do it.
Yeah. So many bells are ringing in my head. I'm gonna try to organize try to organize them. Um, that as you're talking, I think about, as I mentioned, this has come up many times in my audience. We have about 31,000 women in our complementary group, and I hear from women in their 40s and 50s who confuse it maybe with perimenopause. They're not sure, and some of what you're talking about, the emotional regulation, some of the cognitive stuff goes a little haywire as the hormones go haywire. But I also hear from women who have been diagnosed with it, who's like, now I can't function at all. Like they had all their tricks, if you will, they knew what to do. Um, I know that you are working, which it sounds on a very important new book on like women, talking about women across the lifespan and this interplay between hormones and ADHD. And wow, I would love just like a high level discussion here on like what is happening. I do see a lot of women being diagnosed now in our group, freshly diagnosed in their 40s and 50s.
Well, it's not complicated. And by that, I mean, of course, it's complicated what goes on in the brain, but what I mean is that estrogen
Hmm.
and girls start having fluctuating levels of estrogen the minute they hit puberty. And for that reason, that is now a pretty common age at which girls get diagnosed, that they may have been anxious, they may have had struggles at home, they may have had messy rooms and are late to school in the morning, but they're still doing well academically and nobody's noticed it. And then they hit puberty and their estrogen levels start fluctuating. And what we know is estrogen increases the sensitivity of our dopamine receptors and our serotonin receptors. Okay, and for your listeners that may not know, dopamine has to do with focus and ADHD. Serotonin has to do with mood and anxiety. And so that's the reason that girls and women without ADHD even find that they are much moodier, more anxious, more reactive as they go through plummeting estrogen levels once a month.
Yep.
And some females are much more sensitive to that shift than others.
Yep.
So that's just a truth about the female brain that starts with puberty and lasts all the way through menopause. So, what's the connection with ADHD? The connection is that you may or may not, if you're fortunate, have premenstrual syndrome, or even PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is just a fancy way of saying super duper
Yeah.
premenstrual syndrome, where you
Yeah.
get really down, very, very moody, when your estrogen levels are low. And, I can remember doing psychotherapy and asking girls and women that came in with some big upset that had happened at home, where are you in your menstrual cycle?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're premenstrual, let's wait a week and see if you still think it's as big a problem, because you're very vulnerable now
Right.
to overreacting, to hurts, to frustration. So we really need to learn this about our brains, because our serotonin receptors aren't working very well when our estrogen levels are low. So what happens is we're chugging along, going up and down through our countless menstrual cycles, and perimenopause starts on average at age 39. And guess what? When we first started diagnosing women in significant numbers, which was about 25 years ago, and the reason it's about 25 years ago is that the recognition of adult ADHD meant that adult clinics opened. And
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, women had a place to go refer themselves. I mean, they couldn't go to a pediatrician. Do you think
Right.
I have ADHD? And when those adult clinics opened, more women than men went to them. And that was starting 25 years ago. And studies showed that the average age of diagnosis of women with ADHD was age 39,
Hmm.
the average age of the onset of perimenopause. What's important to understand, and a lot of OBGYNs are not trained in this, and they're the ones that are supposedly the hormone experts, um, is that it's not your absolute level of estrogen that is the determining factor, that it seems to be that fluctuating levels of estrogen are what interfere with our serotonin and dopamine receptors. And so for an entire decade during perimenopause, our estrogen levels are declining, declining, and declining. And so it makes a lot of sense. The women you said that came to you that said, if I was in treatment and it was working, it's not working now. Or I did okay before, I didn't have this ADD, and now I do.
Yeah. So, and that makes sense. I mean, we did a show, that late reproductive period, they're kind of calling it now. Like before a woman's even aware that anything's going on, there can be subtle things happening in the background, which is what I'm hearing from you at the start of this menopause transition, that um the sensitivity to it can exist in the brain, which makes it's fascinating and makes sense. I guess I have a really naive question. Um if so let's take a woman who is, let's just call her 40, somewhere in her 40s, and she is experiencing this, and it mirrors a lot of what we see in perimenopause. If she takes some sort of hormone therapy, often at this point they'll put her on the pill to sort of shut down the ovaries and just give her a nice base level of estrogen to stop that fluctuation. If she gets better, does that mean she doesn't have ADHD?
No, of
Okay.
course not.
Uh,
No, it doesn't mean she doesn't have ADHD at all. There are two interacting factors that you're talking about.
okay.
And so you have ADHD, you have it as a girl, it gets worse when you start your periods. It doesn't mean you didn't have it before.
Right.
It's
I guess
worse.
I'm saying, I'm trying to. I understand. I understand. Maybe I didn't ask that correctly. Certainly, I'm not saying hormone therapy fixes ADHD. I'm saying that, I feel like a woman might be able to be like, I am not sure what I am experiencing. Maybe it is just a harder perimenopausal journey. She goes on a hormone therapy and she is better. So then it doesn't seem like that was an underlying ADHD. I'm trying to tease the two of them out.
Gotcha. And one of the important ways to tease it out is because it's so genetic.
Mm,
I would be asking that woman, okay, you were doing pretty well. You would never have told me that you had ADHD, and then you started having these symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went on HRT of some form, and it
Yep.
got better. Does that
Yep.
mean I don't have ADHD?
Right. But
And what I would tell that woman is that the first thing I want you to think about is your genetic makeup. Are there men in your family? Do you have sons with ADHD? Do you have brothers with ADHD? ADHD almost never exists in isolation. I mean, it's just extremely unusual for there to be one member of the family that has ADHD without. It doesn't mean that the rest of them are diagnosed, but that they have it. So that's one thing that I would ask this woman who's suddenly feeling better. And the other thing I would do is explain to her that our ADHD symptoms are not static. They are
mm-hmm.
waxing and waning. And the reason they are waxing and waning is in response to the demands placed upon us by the environment. I
Right.
mean, you could, one of the
Mm.
examples I often use is a gazillion years ago, this poor woman came into my office, and oh my gosh, did she have ADHD? And she came to her appointment frantic and late and tears streaming down her face because she had all her kids in her minivan, and she realized last minute, I need gas. I don't even have enough gas to get to my appointment. I'll just whip in here, get some gas. She jumped out of her car. Boy, did she have ADHD. Forgot to turn her car off, started pumping gas. Her car was filled with her little kiddos. One of her kids accidentally locked the door and her keys are inside. Now cars are made so that you can't do that. You could,
Yeah.
but in those days you sure could do that. And so here she is at the gas station telling the guys, I've got to get somebody to come get my car open. I've got crying, screaming preschoolers in there that don't understand why I can't get back in the car, and they're locked in and I'm locked out. And so she arrived for her appointment just ah.
Mm.
So I used this woman, and I worked with her for quite a while, as an example of the interaction of stress and ADHD. She was one of those girls that did not get along with her mother because she had ADHD and her mother did not. And so her mother was always on her case about,
Mm.
why are you such a mess? And why are you late? And why are you this? And so, anyway, she burst out of her house at an early age to escape this constant shower of criticism, got married, and immediately got pregnant and had twins. And being a Catholic mom, about a year and a half later, she had a singleton, and 2 years after that, she had twins.
Wow.
When she came to me, she had 5 children under the age of 6. And I use that as an example of the interplay of impossible demands and
Right.
ADHD. That the greater the demands that are
Yep.
placed on our brains, the greater our ADHD symptoms will be. And that an awful lot of treatment for ADHD is problem solving. How can we lower your stress levels?
Mm-hmm.
That will lower your ADHD. I work with many women that say, I actually was doing fine after my first baby, but then I had my second, and then I just couldn't do it. I was constantly interrupted, and you know, that's when my ADHD just overcame my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are many things at play: fluctuating hormones, fluctuating stress levels, fluctuating quality of sleep, fluctuating exercise. Do we have time to exercise? One of the things that I think you probably know very well as an athlete is that our healthy or unhealthy daily habits hugely impact how well our brains work.
Yeah.
And there are super athletes with ADHD. In fact, there are quite a few super athletes with ADHD that basically have treated their ADHD with intense exercise and treated it very effectively. Michael Phelps, everybody knows
Yeah.
Michael Phelps' story, and he has ADHD. Lots of super athletes. And what intense exercise does is it changes our brain chemistry temporarily. But if
Yeah.
we exercise every day, we're improving our brain chemistry every day.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And circling just to put a bow on the hormone piece, do we know if hormone therapy is part of the toolkit to help for women in this age demographic?
Yes, I don't think there's any question about it, but we're very far behind in the US.
Okay.
There's no, we are all siloed. Psychiatrists don't know anything about hormones, gynecologists don't know anything about ADHD. And it's really interesting. If you talk to ADHD specialists in the UK, they'll say, but of course, that's part of the treatment. Like, how could you not know that? And I have gone to conferences where people said, why is the US so far behind in terms of understanding that hormone and hormone treatment is a really essential part of treating women with ADHD? And I think what happened was we went through this crazy, exaggerated panic about the dangers of hormone replacement therapy.
Comes up all the
And
time.
women that were taking it, oh my God, I'm going to get cancer. And they, flushed everything down the toilet. It was a gross, exaggerated overreaction. And guess what? When they were weighing and balancing the benefits and the risks of hormone replacement therapy, they did not take the brain into account
Yeah.
at all. That wasn't even on the table, that it actually will help our brains function. We'll have better emotional regulation. We'll have better focus. We can live our lives better with a more functional brain. Wasn't even on the table. And they did an interesting survey at the time when we were going through the hysteria about HRT in the US. They surveyed in the National Health Service in the UK, they surveyed all the 50 and above female physicians in the National Health Service and asked them one simple question: are you personally taking hormone replacement therapy? Almost all of them were. Now, anybody that would be better equipped to know the risks and benefits would be female physicians. And so at the same time that we were going through the HRT hysteria, all of those women were taking hormone replacement. And we're still very, very far behind. And I think part of it is this siloed, you know.
Yeah. We have a lot of super specialization. And to your point, like there's not much cross pollination at all. And there's not a lot. I mean, we've talked many times on the show that, just menopause education in general is is lacking. There's a big lag that it yeah, there's a lot of catching up to be done.
Oh, my partner and I that wrote the book Understanding Girls with ADHD, Understanding Women with ADHD, is a physician, Patricia Quinn, and she and I joked, but never did anything about it, that we're talking to the wrong docs. We need to go and lecture at the gynecological conferences,
Yeah.
not the ADHD conferences, because these
Yeah.
psychiatrists are certainly not going to start prescribing hormones.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That is interesting. And I'm kind of surprised it hasn't. I mean, just given what I am seeing and what you're saying, that it's not um I think the conversation is bubbling up to the surface, but I don't feel like it's reached critical mass yet. I guess that's the best way to put it. Yeah.
I think we're
Go ahead.
going through a really important shift now, though. And
Hmm.
I don't know if you know about Attitude Magazine, which I think is a wonderful publication. ADDI
Oh, I
TUDE.
saw it while I was doing my research for this episode.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
it is a great publication, and you can subscribe to it online and I get something in my inbox almost every day, and they have been so strongly promoting the need for research on ADHD in women and the inequities and the lack of awareness in the idea. I
Hmm.
mean, just article after article. And I was instrumental in creating a petition that we posted on change.org, uh, basically trying to get as many signatures as possible about the need for more research on women with ADHD, because we're caught in this circular loop. I kept going to the researchers saying we need to change the diagnostic criteria because women are getting missed. And they're saying we can't change the diagnostic criteria because there's no
I knew
research.
you were going to say that.
And there's no research because nobody is thinking of doing the research. I mean, it's just caught in
Yeah.
this endless loop. So Attitude Magazine and our petition on change.org, we've already got many, many, many signatures, and we're going to keep going because it's such an important issue. You know, they're coming out now, they're starting to recommend adult guidelines for
Mm.
ADHD. And I wrote immediately to the head of the committee, whom I've known for many years, and said, well, David, are you going to think about adult criteria for women? And he gives me the party line. Well, no, we're not doing that. I mean, the first thing we're going to do is talk about adults, i.e., males.
Yeah.
And when and if there's research showing differences in females, then we'll, that'll be an afterthought somewhere down the road.
Oh, boy, I hear this so often on the show. It's disheartening, but I'm encouraged by people like yourself, and I do know things are changing. I'm curious, you had mentioned, and while you're talking, it just made me think of it. You had mentioned how, with boys, there was this idea or evidence that the hyperactivity and some of the symptoms that were part of that diagnosis had this trajectory that they did seem to dissipate some. Do girls' symptoms follow any kind of a similar trajectory at all?
I think if anything, girls' symptoms increase
Okay.
as we get older, and that's for a number of reasons. Um, Girls with ADHD are much more likely than boys, and this is true for men and women as well, to have coexisting anxiety and depression,
Mm,
which becomes more intense as we get older. I think that the expectations placed on women, I mean, the very things that women are, I put this in quotes for your listeners, I'm using quotes, supposed to be good at,
right.
uh, are the very things that ADHD brains are not good at. Women are supposed to keep track of everybody's calendar.
Multitasking.
Joey has soccer practice and Susie has a dentist appointment, and oh, my husband's going to be out of town for the next 3 days. They're supposed to track everything and keep the meals and the laundry and the housework and the transportation going while working full time, of course, in the past 2 generations. And I think it's a ridiculous expectation for women without ADHD and an impossible expectation for women with ADHD. And so I find that the demoralization, the low self-esteem
Mm,
just increase as the greater demands are piled on us as we
yeah.
go through life.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. If to be extremely clear, this is a clinical diagnosis, correct? Like there's no test.
Right. There's no medical
Right,
test.
right. Yeah.
And one of the things I think is so important for people to understand is the more we understand about the brain, the more we realize that ADHD is really a collection of issues.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one singular disorder, like the psychologist I quoted. Oh, I thought it was just insufficient dopamine in the prefrontal lobes.
Right.
It's not that at all. Something fascinating that we know now is associated with ADHD is, if you've heard of neural networks,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking much more about neural networks and in terms of brain functioning than sort of geographic locations in the
Mm-hmm.
brain.
Mm-hmm.
That this is the language center and this is the motor center. They're neural networks. And one of the networks that you'll hear a lot about is called the default mode network. And that's just a fancy way of saying the way your brain sort of thinks of anything and everything when you have absolutely nothing to do. Like if you're sitting in the dentist's office and there's nothing interesting to read, you're in your default mode network and you might be thinking about dinner tonight or what you said to Harriet this morning, or gee, I need to clip my fingernails. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows what your mind is just wandering. And then there is a task mode network. Okay, now it's time to fill out this form, give you the clipboard and the pen. You're sitting in the doctor's
Yep.
office, and then you're in the task mode network. Okay, what's my social, what's my, you're filling it out. And in the neurotypical brain, your default mode network turns off because now you got a task to do. In
Interesting.
the
Hmm.
ADHD brain, it does not turn off.
That's fascinating.
And that is, I mean, we know a lot about what they call internal distractibility, but that's literally what's going on. That you're doing a task, but there's all this other stuff bubbling around. Now, in some ways, that's extremely inconvenient, but in other ways, it's strongly associated with creativity.
For
That
sure.
it's our default mode network, which is sort of the genesis of new ideas. And so we don't read nearly enough about this. Again, not very many people are doing the research, but that there really is a neurologically explained connection between ADHD and creativity.
That's really, really interesting. That is fascinating on many levels. Um, which also, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, which begs the question, like, for some people that might be a superpower, right? If they're a creative
You
person.
got it.
Yeah.
Absolutely no question.
Yeah. So I guess the question then is for women listening who are thinking, I think this is me, like what should they, and it's disruptive to their life. It's not, they don't feel like they have this superpower. They feel like I can't function. Like, what is their first step? Who should they see if they think that's what they are experiencing?
Well, first of all, if they can find one, I would suggest they see a woman.
Mm,
And that would be a woman psychiatrist, a woman psychologist, a woman psychotherapist. There's no test. I mean, we at my clinic, we do huge, elaborate neuropsychological evaluations. And there's certain patterns that we see on those neuropsych evals that are common
mm-hmm.
for people with ADHD, that you're really good at this and less good at that. But that's not universally true. I mean, you can't rule out ADHD, and I see it happening all the time, and they're wrong, saying you did too well on this test, so you can't have it. That's simply not true. I mean, bright people can sit in a quiet room and do well on a test, but then they go out the door and their cell phone's ringing, and
Right.
that, oh, shoot, I forgot my umbrella, and oh, it's,
Yeah.
and life impinges. And we don't have any tests that are good imitations of real life to
Yeah.
measure what happens when you've got this booming, buzzing brain trying to interact with a very distracting world.
Increasingly distracting world.
Right. So, where does a woman get diagnosed? Um, I am contacted from women all over the country because they go online
Yeah.
and they say, I cannot find anybody. It's well worth at least going somewhere to get that diagnosis. If you live in a rural area, most ADHD experts are in the few major metropolitan areas or in and around universities.
Right.
And even there, you're still going to find people that have a very narrow, inadequate understanding of ADHD. So they really need to do their research.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll often get an email, I'm in Sacramento, and I'm on the East Coast. Can you tell me anybody in my part of the world that I could go to?
Yeah.
Because there are not very many of us, but almost all of us are women,
Hmm.
which is not surprising.
Yeah.
There's a reason.
Um, yeah, there is a reason. And then, we talked, you talked about exercise being helpful. We've talked about hormones, stabilizing hormone levels. What other courses of, treatment therapy? I imagine you had mentioned behavioral, sort of like
Well,
toolbox kit kind of stuff. What else? Stimulants. Where does that all fit in
I'm
a woman's
so
care?
glad you asked that question.
Okay.
We we are in the world of understanding how brains function, how we can get them to function better, what we're doing in our lives that make them function worse. We are now understanding that, for example, Alzheimer's is, if anything, more the result of lifestyle than genetics.
Yeah.
And they're referring to it now as type 3 diabetes, just to
Hmm.
imply that, our lifestyle. So we are starting a program at my clinic that I have dubbed our Shines program. And Shines stands for sleep, hormones, integrative psychiatry, nutrition, exercise, and stress management.
Hmm. There you have
That's
it.
what we need to do to get our brains to function at their best. And a lot of those efforts are interactive. Like
Yeah.
I always tell people, exercising outside not only gives you the wonderful neurochemicals of exercise, but you're also around other people and you're out in nature. And there's an interesting body of research showing that ADHD symptoms go down in direct relationship to how much we're outside in nature.
Yeah. I just wrote about forest bathing actually,
There
and
you
like,
go. You got it.
and
Yes.
green space and brain health is really interesting. Yeah.
And so that's our Shines program, which we're just starting to launch. And this is not anything I've invented. I mean, this is just, I think there's just a growing consensus that these are the things we need to do. We need to get away from having the Western American diet that is, high in chemicals, high in
Hmm.
processed food, sugar,
Yeah.
fat, that all of that is really bad for our brains.
Yeah.
So,
And go ahead. Were stimulation medications in the Shine? What?
no, stimulant medications are not in Shines. Everybody knows that stimulants helps
Yeah.
ADHD. And if you can only do one thing, if somebody was going to prevent you from getting enough sleep and
Right.
exercise, if you could only do one thing, I'd say yes, try stimulant
Gotcha.
medication. But interestingly, studies show that adults don't stay on stimulants long term,
Hmm.
that they often have side effects that people don't like.
Right.
That it gives them stomach aches or headaches, or they lose their appetite and then they're ravenous and eat a bunch of junk when it wears
Yeah.
off. And it feels like you're on a roller coaster ride. And so a lot of studies show that adults only stay on stimulants for 3 years or so,
Yeah.
and they stop, but they don't have. So now what do I do?
Right. You need that whole ecosystem to support your brain. Yeah,
Right.
that
And
that
you
makes sense.
obviously know a lot about that.
Oh, yeah. As you're talking, I'm like, I know OCD, but do I know? Yeah, I think I don't, you know. Yeah, I manage a lot through exercise. So
Right.
that's a fact. Um, You also, and I want to touch on this because I know that there's a lot of women in my audience who are in their 60s and beyond. And you've talked about that too, people being diagnosed over 60. And I imagine, is there anything, I guess, that we haven't talked about that is unique to that population that we should cover?
Sure. First of all, most physicians have an exaggerated sense of it being complicated and dangerous to prescribe stimulants
Hmm.
to people in retirement years. And I actually had a psychiatrist at my clinic that said, I will not treat anyone over the age of 60. I will not. It's, they might have cardiac issues. They're on so many medications, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? In nursing homes with ancient, fragile people, they prescribe stimulants a lot. I mean, very commonly, they prescribe stimulants to give those poor souls more energy,
Yeah,
more, because they're just, and so if it's not dangerous in a nursing home, I don't know how it could be dangerous in a healthy 65-year-old. Um, so
agreed.
stimulants work just as well. And I can't tell you how many people have written me over these past years saying, I was diagnosed, I was on stimulants. My doctor retired. I can't find anyone else that will prescribe them because they don't know about it and they think it's dangerous. So that's one thing. Number two, a lot of people who were never diagnosed with ADHD, the combination of age-related cognitive decline and undiagnosed ADHD, they are more forgetful and they get terrified as this the beginning of Alzheimer's.
Yeah,
And they will go to a memory clinic, and guess what? Very, very few, I think the figures are about 15% of memory clinics ever consider the possibility of undiagnosed ADHD.
yeah.
And so I actually, in my book, Still Distracted After All These Years on Older Adults, I talk about a case. A journalist contacted me and said, this happened to my mother.
Hmm.
And he said she'd had ADHD her whole life. Of course, it wasn't diagnosed. I mean, who diagnosed women in those days? And my father, they were living in Florida like all good retirees. And my father just, your mother is so forgetful. I'm worried about dementia. And he hauled her off to an older male neurologist who knew nada about ADHD, much less in women, who diagnosed this poor woman with Alzheimer's and put her on medication for Alzheimer's. So about 3 years later, her husband dies, and she calls her son and says, I don't believe I have Alzheimer's, and I would really like to go see a different neurologist. He didn't pay any attention to me, just listened to your father. And so he took her to a younger female neurologist, this was in the Miami area, who diagnosed her ADHD. But sadly, I wish this had a happy ending,
Hmm.
said, but there's nothing you can do about it. And I'm going, oh my God, you know enough.
It's a terrible answer.
I said, there's lots you can do about it. So the things that when you say, what are the concerns for older women? One is be sure that ADHD is considered if you're becoming concerned about your memory. And the first thing to do is look at your family. You've almost
Yeah,
certainly got kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews who've been diagnosed. And if they've been diagnosed, that's a good place to start with,
right.
what's going on up here?
Yeah, yeah.
Number two is, I think that one of the big risks for older adults with ADHD is all the structure in our life goes away.
Hmm.
We're retired, our kids are grown, we may have lost a spouse if we were married, and all the, if we had friends at work, we don't have contact with those people again. And social isolation and
Hmm.
lack of structure is a perfect recipe for ADHD to take over your life.
Yeah.
And one of the stories I tell in my book is a woman who was very functional. She was a single mom with ADHD, but she worked as a teacher. She raised her daughters. And when she retired and moved to the Washington, D.C. area where I live, her daughter came to me saying, I'm very worried about my mother. And what had happened is she moved into an apartment all by herself. She didn't know a soul and she hadn't lived there. She was from Pennsylvania. And she said, my mother's never really unpacked. The dining room wall is piled high with boxes. She's eating cheese and crackers out of the refrigerator. She's staying up half the night and sleeping half the morning. She's just lost. She's absolutely lost. And I told the daughter, I think the biggest thing that you could do for your mother is to find some kind of senior housing that she could move into that has activities
Yep.
and people to socialize with and people to eat lunch and dinner with. And she doesn't have to cook her own lunch and dinner. And so she's just living out of,
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot harder to take good care of yourself. It's a lot harder
Yeah.
to create structure in your day, which is, of course, much better for our brains.
Yeah, for sure. Whew. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground, and this has been a really insightful conversation. I really appreciate the work you're doing in this area. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, or any final messages that you would want to leave with our audience on this topic?
Yes, one of the things I would say is there's all kinds of support for women out there that think they may have ADHD. One organization that I strongly recommend looking into is ADDA, ADDA.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, and it focuses more on adult ADHD.
Okay.
It's a very active group. They have all kinds of online support groups. They have all kinds of online free lectures, and it's a great way to meet other people, to get really scientifically based information, and just get support.
Yeah. Excellent. I will put all of that in the show notes so people can just easily find it and access, as well as your information and your resources. Thank you again so much, and continue to keep fighting the good fight, Dr. Nadeau. I
Well,
really
you're
appreciate it.
fighting an awfully good fight too. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with Alexa Ulrich and Morella Russell of the Housewives of Hip Hop for a very moving interview about the healing power of community and dance. You won't want to miss this one. So come on back for that. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.